Hello, Dan Alasso with History for Today. And this morning I have some thoughts on an article that I just reread as I'm beginning to bring a lot of these things that I have read and made notes on in Margin Note into my Obsidian graph and figuring out how to turn them into knowledge. This was a book chapter by Markus Krajewski. Apparently there are at least a couple of Markus Krajewskis working in European academia. One is a former lawyer who teaches constitutional law. The one I'm interested in is a professor at the University of Basel, I believe, or at least he was at the University of Basel in the Department of Arts, Media, and Philosophy. And he wrote an article called Paper as Passion, Niklas Luhmann and his Card Index. And he wrote this in 2011, and it appears in 2013 in a book, I believe, called Raw Data is an Oxymoron by Lisa Gittelman et al., published by the MIT Press. I've mentioned this before, but I think I've had some new ideas about this, so I'm going to go over it again, as I tend to do from time to time, with readings that I think are significant. So Krajewski begins this article not with Luhmann actually, but with a 15-year-old Hegel, who apparently began a slipbox himself in 1785. In the third paragraph, Krajewski gets to Luhmann, who was the reason that I had searched out this article in the first place. He tells a little story of Luhmann as an old academic in 1997 in his 70s, and he quotes Niklas Luhmann, apparently from either Archimedes und Wir interviews or from Kommunikation mit Zettelkasten. It's not really clear to me which one. But in one of those, Luhmann says, "When I read a book, I do it in the following way. I always have a note card on hand, on which I note the ideas of certain pages. On the backside, I record the bibliographical information. When I've read through the book, then I go through these notes and consider what could be useful for notes that have already been written. Thus, I always read with an eye toward the notability of books." And when I quoted that in my little essay in Obsidian, I made one of these new links that I figured out how to do back to the article and back to that quote itself in Margin Note 3. Now, this was the first thing that I highlighted in this article, and it may have been the most important. A couple of things jump out at me about it. It's another expression of that idea that reading involves writing, which I like very much, because I do think that if I'm doing more than just passing the time, I should be in dialogue with the text that involves me responding to what the author is saying. And the way I record my responses, of course, is by writing them down. But a second thing that jumps out at me from this passage is the sort of elegant simplicity of the idea of having a pen and a card and knowing what to do with them. I really like this idea. It strikes me that it may be a better idea to carry around a little index card-sized notebook and a pen with me than to rely on voice memos and other electronic tools that I've been trying to use as I'm walking and listening to audiobooks or podcasts, for example. Sönke Ahrens and others have pointed out that it's writing something down that sort of anchors it in our minds. Ahrens has even suggested that students should be encouraged to handwrite notes on paper rather than typing them into a notebook during lectures. I'm not really sure that I'm quite ready to go that far, but I think that the point is well taken. So I think I'll try this process. I'll take a little notebook on walks with me and a pen and stop and record my thoughts as I'm listening to content. I've also actually had a couple of moments in class when a discussion with students has gone in an interesting, unexpected direction when I thought, gee, it would be nice to record this idea so that I can come back to it later and explore it. I generally have a pad of paper to write quick notes about what the students are saying so that I can respond to them at the appropriate time. Often it's not immediate because the students are responding to each other and I don't want to jump in and break that up. But I do like to note things down so that I can go back to them. And the last big idea that I get from this quote is the idea that Luhmann was reading with a purpose. He said this several times in other sources that I've read as well. He had a question in his mind and he was looking for an answer to it in the text. This predetermined question gives reading a sort of quest-like directedness. When I read this way, I feel like I'm not entirely open-mindedly waiting for whatever the author may want to tell me. This approach has advantages and it has disadvantages. On one hand, it helps me find the information that I need, that I'm looking for. On the other hand, kind of ironically, like the system of organizing notes that Luhmann was avoiding, it might limit the serendipity of finding something that you weren't already looking for. There's a passage somewhere in one of the two Douglas Adams, Dirk Gently books that I've searched for a couple of times, and I've been unable to find it. My inability to find it is actually getting on my nerves a bit, so I may have to listen to those audiobooks soon with that little notebook handy. The passage talks about how the detective, Dirk Gently, believing firmly in the interconnectedness of all things, goes out into the world to search for clues in a particular way. He doesn't look for a specific thing, of which there are bound to be only a few, or even one instance of them. Instead, he looks for anything that might be useful, on the idea that since he doesn't really know what might be useful, the odds are that there are more of those types of things lying around than the former. Douglas Adams, of course, puts it much better. I think there are probably two types of reading that I typically do for research, aside from the purely recreational type. And it's interesting that my next listen to the Dirk Gently series will not be the purely recreational type. It will be for some of these ideas. But in any case, in one of these ways of reading, I'm approaching the text with a specific question, and probably less interested than I might otherwise be what the author herself or himself is interested in. And this may be kind of an extreme case, I think. For example, in Krajewski's article, as I said, I'm not at all really interested in the Hegel stuff, but I think still I more or less got the point of what the author was trying to say about the historical continuity of card-based note-taking, and also the fact that Luhmann was doing something a little bit different. On the other hand, maybe I am missing something. After all, this is the 6th chapter of a book, and it exists within a bigger context of Krajewski's own interest and research in card cataloging systems. So maybe what happens to interest me about Luhmann's process is just a sort of interesting side note in a larger conversation for these other people. Maybe I should be more interested in that. I'm not at the moment, but being aware that there may be more in there might be useful to me in the future. In the second case of reading, where I'm not looking for a specific answer, I think I tend to be, and I think I can be, more open to the author's argument. And this may be the case recently for me with something like Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, or Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Anti-Fragile. I had heard that these were interesting, and I had a sense that they probably contained ideas that I would find fascinating and I could probably use in some form. But I wasn't really sure what those ideas would be specifically, beyond going into them kind of looking for a list and explanations of the various heuristics that Kahneman had found, and Taleb's elaboration of his black swan idea, which was all I really knew about him at the time. So in these cases, I needed to be much more open to whatever the authors might say throughout the book, since I wasn't sure going in what I was going to find credible and what I was going to find valuable. Krajewski goes on to describe the arbitrary numbering system that Luhmann used. This is another instance of that issue of eliminating that bias for particular outcomes that seems to come with reading with a question in mind, or naming a note and designating a folder for it. Krajewski talks about the slip box reaching what he calls critical mass of entries and links, at which point something happens that at least appears to be non-linear and somewhat emergent. But is this actually what happens, or is this just a convenient metaphor for the serendipity that's happening, which is certainly exciting but may not really be a phase change in our thinking, but may simply be a new path through the information that we haven't considered? That would be valuable and exciting enough, I suspect, to make the exercise worthwhile. On that same page, Krajewski mentions that the idea develops during speech. This, I think, is another metaphor that should be picked at a little bit. We're all familiar with the exciting process of thinking out loud and the places that an idea can go when we're challenged by a conversation partner with a slightly different perspective, slightly different interests, slightly different goals. The claim is that the slipbox can actually stand in for another such human mind. At one point, Krajewski actually calls it an independently thinking slipbox, which I've got to imagine is a knowingly exaggerated statement intended to make a point. Or is it, though? A few lines later, he quotes what he calls the basic philological precept that the text knows more than the author. Is this meant in the Barthian sense? Maybe I'll have to read The Death of the Author. But my gut reaction to that argument is that I don't understand why Roland Barthes would decenter the author, but try to preserve and actually try to establish the centrality of the reader as a person without history, biography, psychology, as he says. It seems to me that if the author is culturally constructed, the reader, being equally a human individual, probably is as well. But I'm not a literary critic. And that's a digression. And maybe that's an example of something that Krajewski may be much more interested in than I am, which I might actually be able to safely avoid engaging with and still get what I'm looking for out of the article. In between the two sentences that I just objected to, Krajewski quotes Walter Benjamin saying, "The book is an archaic intermediate between two different card index systems." The implication being that the author had one and that a good reader probably has one as well. And this is an interesting way of thinking about it, I think. Probably much more interesting to me than the way Barthes imagined it, if I'm being honest. I like the idea that a book is a limited thing. However complex it is, it's a mere statement of an idea passing between two minds that are capable of many more ideas and much more complexity. I've been attracted to this metaphor that I've mentioned before, that the book is a path through a forest of information. Not necessarily the only path, and not necessarily the best path. In a section called The Secret of the System, Krajewski then says that Luhmann claimed that the note gains value with the increasing number of connections made to it, and that he appreciated the slipbox's ability to produce what he called combinatorial possibilities, which had never been planned, intended, or conceived as such. Krajewski concludes that the structure of the system will create what he calls complex structures of combined thoughts without outside assistance. But he admits that due to the way that notes are written, they're probably comprehensible only to their writer. So the slipbox isn't really a universal communication partner that anybody can use, only the writer of the notes. So, having said all that, the question remains, is it better to avoid organization in order to allow for the greatest possible combinatorial flexibility and see where that takes me? How do I create this in Obsidian? Links within the notes themselves rather than page names? Should I turn on that Zettelkasten page naming function? Should I avoid folders? Should I avoid tags? If so, then what role do evergreen notes have in such a system? Evergreen notes, in my understanding, being atomic statements of ideas that tend to be anchor nodes in a map of thoughts. One thing that does occur to me is that Luhmann wrote hundreds of articles and like 6 books, but they don't appear inside the slipboxes. They were the output of the machine. So maybe that is something that I need to rethink as well. Maybe I've been sort of indiscriminately grouping inputs and thoughts about them as I process them and outputs in the same box of my Obsidian vault. I don't think that I necessarily want to stop doing that, but I may want to start distinguishing between inputs and processing and outputs in my graph. And maybe that is a more appropriate role for tags, distinguishing between the types of entries rather than grouping topics. So once again, this is a work in process, and I haven't come to any conclusions yet. I have started doing this with the tags and tagging my inputs and processing and outputs and coloring them differently so that I can see them in the graph itself. And I'll report more when I've done more and when I've seen how it works. So I hope people found that a little bit interesting. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next time.